This episode of Conjuncture was recorded in Toronto in December 2024 and produced with support of the Trinity Social Justice Institute and the Antipode Foundation.
Welcome to Conjuncture. My name is Christina Heatherton. I'm delighted to be here with Kanishka Goonewardena. Kanishka is a professor of geography and planning at the University of Toronto. He was trained as an architect in Sri Lanka and now teaches and writes about neoliberalism and the production of space, the constellation of colonialism, imperialism, and nationalism, and critical theory. His writings on emancipatory thought have been influential for scholars and organizers alike. He is a co-editor of Space, Difference, Everyday Life, reading Henri Lefebvre, and is completing the book The Future of Planning at the End of History. His current research is about the history of the concept of imperialism. I'm delighted to be speaking with him today here in Toronto. So Kanishka, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. Yeah, honored to be in this series, given the range of people, illustrious people that you have spoken to.
Perfect compliment to it. Well, I want to start here. You often begin your political biography in Sri Lanka during the political crises of the 1980s, where you were working as an architect and planner. And it seemed you learned at the time, to quote Theodore Adorno, that the, quote, wrong life cannot be lived rightly. So you say that there you gained an anti-imperialist perspective that was not merely anti-Western or anti-Eurocentric, but one that was also deeply critical of nationalism. So perhaps we can start there. How did this conjuncture in Sri Lanka shape your politics, and how did it influence your understanding of imperialism?
Yeah, so this is a great question, to think with the concept of conjuncture, and so I was, university student, in the mid 1980s. So I started in 84, graduated in 88, but this was a time of intense political conflict and with a lot of violence as well. And much of the conflict was an ethnic conflict between initially several groups of Tamil separatists, but later, one dominant group, the LTTE or the Tamil Tigers, and the government state of Sri Lanka. But on the simultaneously, in the late 80s, there was a insurrectionary, let's say, left extreme, kind of a movement led by this party, JVP, or the People's Liberation Front, or Janata Vimukti Peramuna in Sinhala, who are actually currently in power in Sri Lanka, right? And so the Sri Lankan state in the mid to late 80s was attacked, from two sides, let's say, right? And so going to being an undergraduate student at this time, it was impossible, not to, think about the ethnic, conflict, the violence of it, and also the nature of class struggle in Sri Lanka, right? And also the need to understand all of that within a more global geographical as well as a longer historical perspective. So in that conjuncture, we also had to, of course, think about the more organic, determinants, as well in the Gramscian terms that your, podcast has illustrated so well with many conversations. And but I was also a student, as you mentioned, in architecture at the University of Moratuwa. And so one thing I had to deal, along with some of my close friends, that we had to deal with, was the fact that our education in architecture was, while on the one hand, like really brilliant and excellent in terms of training us to be great designers, it was utterly lacking in political and critical perspective, right? And so we had a bit of a struggle, or more than a bit of a struggle, to figure out what the relevance of our work as architects creative people, creative artists, and so on, to in the in the context of the great political challenges with which the country as a whole was confronting, right? So that in that conjuncture, it was impossible to be like a simple-minded nationalist, let's say, so to kind of think politics in terms of a simple east-west kind of a binary, right? I mean, to return to your question, I think, so I was compelled, I think, to develop dialectical, perspective on nationalism, right? That it can, under certain historical conditions, certain aspects, of nationalism, and even including cultural nationalism. But we can also think about economic nationalism, and so on. The nationalism can have a progressive and even an emancipatory and revolutionary aspect, but it can also, in again, in a particular context, can have very regressive and reactionary possibilities, right? So I think Sri Lanka, the history of Sri Lanka provides a great example, of the different valences of nationalist politics. Right? So having come out of that, those experiences, this binary of Europe versus the rest, the West versus the rest, is something that has never really appealed to me, as in terms of critical thinking.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah. Well, I wonder if we might turn a little to the current conjuncture in Sri Lanka. In some ways, as you've written and described, Sri Lanka shares common features of many countries globally. There's a failed neoliberal project, there's rising right-wing and xenophobic forces, and there's a failure of political liberalism to contain the contradictions. The country, of course, has its own distinct features, such as the dynamics of its sovereign debt, which I hope we can talk a little bit about, and the nature of populist projects there. So I wonder if you could just help us understand the current conjuncture in and through Sri Lanka. And I wonder if, relatedly, you could help us understand the shift that you described from anti-colonial struggle to authoritarian neoliberalism.
Yes. So I think let's begin with like the most recent events, which some viewers may be aware of, just from looking at the global news reports. So about 2 years ago, there was a serious sovereign debt crisis, which but foreign debt has been kind of a perennial problem, for Sri Lanka, for several decades, from, let's say, the 70s onwards, especially. But it kind of went totally out of control, 2 years ago, to such an extent that the country did not have enough foreign reserves to buy even such basic necessities as oil, right? So there were lots of cars, parked in their garages without, and people owning these cars, mostly upper middle class to rich people. They had money to buy petrol, but there was no petrol, and a little bit, more generally across the sort of the class spectrum, cooking oil was also, in short supply, right? And so there were long lines, to get petrol into the cars, and there were 13, 14-hour power cuts, electricity outages. So it came to this unprecedented crisis situation, and people came onto the streets. There were massive protests, especially in Colombo, and so out of that, these mostly spontaneous mobilizations, massive kind of pressure, emerged, and which ultimately, forced the president to get out of the country and resign, and a new president from the opposition party was, according to the constitutional and parliamentary procedures, was chosen, and that is Ranil Wickremesinghe, who comes from a political party that has traditionally been the more pro-Western, pro-free market and neoliberal kind of a political party. And his uncle, J.R. Jayawardena, who became first prime minister and then immediately president after a crucial constitutional amendment in 1977, introduced, the so-called open economy in Sri Lanka and inaugurated what we know as neoliberalism today. And in this sense, Sri Lanka, along, probably after Chile, was one of the first, third world countries to become neoliberal in this way, right? And it is important to kind of understand in a historical perspective, because until then, the political power in Sri Lanka alternated between this neoliberal party and a more social democratic and a nationalist, Sri Lankan Freedom Party, SLFP, and which pursued policies more in the line of non-aligned development, import substitute industrialization, with not great success maybe, but it was a different orientation, right? For national development, right? And on the basis of local development of local industry, right? And import substitution, industrialization, and which completely went out of the window, like after the radical neoliberal reforms, and this, I think, over time, set off a secular tendency of becoming more and more indebted, right? Which kind of reached a crisis situation, as I described, a couple of years ago, and the solution to this crisis, was yet another, deal, with the International Monetary Fund, with predictable austerity conditions.
Turns out.
Yeah, which kind of, I think, the consequences were such that the everyday life, economic situation, especially the cost of living, became really unbearable to a lot of Sri Lankans. And so in the most recent presidential election in a couple of months ago, which was won by the candidate from the JVP, led coalition, which attempted revolutions, in insurrections in '89 and previously also in 1971. And so he won the presidential election, and this was unthinkable, like 2 or 3 years ago. But the reason was the complete disillusionment, of the two major political parties that has been governing Sri Lanka since independence in 1948. And again, in the more recent, just about less than a month ago, in the parliamentary election, the same coalition of the JVP-led coalition won more than a 2/3 majority in parliament, right? And this is unprecedented, right? So this party had 3 seats in the previous parliament. Now they have more than 150, right? So this kind of goes to show the extent of the dissatisfaction of the people with the neoliberal, experiment. But so the great question, great challenge, I think, currently before the present government, especially given the great electoral, mandate that they have received, is whether they can really pursue an alternative economic policy, right? Economic trajectory, right? And so the way I see it, with the required pragmatism, also that is realism that is also required in these situations, is there is an opportunity, but it remains to be seen how the current regime responds to the challenge, right? So I think the range of possibilities, I would say, lie somewhere between, in the best case scenario, what Lula achieved in Brazil, and in the worst case scenario, what Tsipras and Syriza did not achieve in Greece.
Thanks for that, Kanishka. That was extremely helpful. I want to talk a little bit about Fanon, because you often invoke Frantz Fanon in your writing, and I think what's interesting at this moment is you don't invoke him simply as an avatar of anti-colonial struggle, but for what he describes in The Wretched of the Earth as the pitfalls of national consciousness. I'm curious to know why you find this emphasis of Fanon relevant for our time, and why, as you write, should emancipatory politics move past ethnic nationalism?
Yes, no, that's a great question. I think especially important because given the experiences, or the out of which I came out of Sri Lanka, and kind of became a grad student in the US, and eventually an academic. My sort of relationship to certain strands of what is called post-colonial or even decolonial theory is not very typical, So in this sense, so my kind of appreciation of Fanon also may not be the most commonplace, But of course, let's acknowledge, I think, that Fanon is an extremely original and suggestive thinker for various reasons. His sort of work as a psychiatrist, and his training in the French, phenomenological kind of a tradition, is sort of understanding of the body, of space, that my friend and colleague Stefan Kipfer, among others, have written about, and and of course his work as a kind of intellectual, in the especially African, national liberation movements, right? But for me, the most striking aspect of Fanon is, I read him as a student of social relations, within the context of anti-colonial struggle, but of course with a socialist orientation and a goal, right? And so he's a for me, his politics of national liberation and the anti-colonial struggle was basically one with the struggle for the socialism, right? And this was, I think, well understood, during, in the time, of those national liberation movements, not only in the African continent, but pretty much, in the tri-continental tradition, right? And around the world. And it is not to be taken for granted in post-colonial or decolonial kind of discourses today, right? And so for me, that chapter was so instructive, that is to say, the pitfalls of national consciousness chapter in the Wretched of the Earth book, because it spoke so precisely and insightfully to the Sri Lankan experience, out of which I emerged, right? And so the danger that he anticipated has unfortunately been actualized, all too often, in various, national liberation movements, in countries that became independent in a formal sense, from colonial powers, but were unable for, complex, overdetermined local and global, forces to pursue the path towards socialism, right? So all of this, I think, has to be also understood with reference to the nature of Frantz Fanon's critique of Eurocentrism, and that is to say, critique of Europe, right? Europe as the representative of a fake humanism, false universality, right? But by critiquing, European imperialism in this way, he was very careful not to reject universalism or humanism or radical, revolutionary humanism. Throw that also out, with the bathwater, sort of, that babies, those babies also out with the bathwater, so in the conclusion of the Wretched of the Earth, it is very clear, I think, that he insists on the task of these national liberation movements is really ultimately to produce a real humanism, right? A better humanism, rather than the pretend or fake humanism, of Europe, of liberalism, right? So this, I think, is, as far as I'm concerned, essential to an understanding of Frantz Fanon, right? And I also kind of I'm closely tied to, through friend networks and, political connections to what's going on in Sri Lanka. So, I'm not politically active in the sense of belonging to a party and, kind of things like that. But I talk to people. I write once in a while about what's happening there. And so in my interactions, I often engaged in debate about the dangers, of nationalism, right? But also trying to think about how nationalism can be progressive and can be can have an organic relationship with socialist politics, forms of organization, and aspirations more broadly, right? But if that is possible, then we are really not talking about like kind of particularisms. It is like a unique, there's a dialectic of particularism and universalism. So we must. I think my reading of Fanon, in this sense, I have to emphasize, is also decisively, informed and educated by Atoseki Oto's work, right? His especially his book on militant universalism, right? Yeah.
Well, thank you for that, Kanishka. I really appreciate your engagement with the relationship between universalism and particularism. There's certainly no babies being thrown out in the bathwater, and I imagine we'll come back to this a little later in our conversation. But you did mention your friend and collaborator, Stefan Kipfer, and we should say we are taken over his home.
Yeah.
I want to say I was introduced to your work and your collaborations together by abolitionists over a decade ago who were insistent that in order to understand the dynamics of neoliberalism, capitalism, and policing, I had to understand both of your work. Together you've done tremendous work to engage, extend, and politically translate the work of French philosopher Henri Lefebvre. Some of our audience might not be familiar with his work, so before I ask a question, I thought I might read a passage from his book, The Urban Revolution. I'm saying it like I'm asking you a question, but that's what I'm about to do. So here it goes. Urban alienation contains and perpetuates all other forms of alienation. In it, through it, segregation becomes commonplace by class, by neighborhood, by profession, by age, by ethnicity, by sex. Crowds and loneliness. Space becomes increasingly rare. It is expensive, a luxury and privilege maintained and kept up through practice and various strategies. The city indeed does grow richer. It attracts wealth and monopolizes culture just as it concentrates power, but it collapses under the weight of its wealth. The more it concentrates the necessities of life, the more unlivable it becomes. The notion that happiness is possible in the city, that there is more intense pleasure is enhanced, and leisure time more abundant is mystification and myth. If there is a connection between social relationships and space, between places and human groups, we must, if we are to establish cohesion, radically modify the structure of space. So I wonder if you could tell us about Lefebvre and what this Western Marxist thinker has to teach us today.
Yeah, that's a great quotation, by the way. So thanks for reminding me of it. So Urban Revolution has some very suggestive insights and formulations, but I think this is a particularly good one to basically, it's a perfect illustration of how Lefebvre understood the dialectical relationship between space and society, spatial relations and social relations, right? And I would, in my kind of understanding of Lefebvre, there is, the way he kind of explains the significance of space is through holistic perspective on society, that Lefebvre proposes, which I think is an original conception of what the Hegelian Marxist kind of tradition calls the concept of totality, right? So the usually, this in the more orthodox kind of Marxisms, this is understood as some kind of a base superstructure relationship, but Lefebvre has a, he also, he sometimes uses the base superstructure terminology as well, but in the Urban Revolution in particular, there's a chapter, not far from the passage that you're quoting, called Levels and Dimensions, where he kind of invites us to consider, the world that we live in as one that is conditioned at a deep, more structural kind of a level by some fundamental political and economic forces, which he calls the global level, meaning in the French sense, the general level, right? And the two most important aspects are the economic forces, capitalism or the law of value, let's say, right? And the force of the state, as a its own, relatively autonomous kind of, political, self-interested and self-aggrandizing political rationality. Right? And so that is the deep general level, what he calls the global. And then there's the level of everyday life of people, like going about the, business, and kind of hanging out with friends, taking care of people, all that stuff, everyday life. But the question is, how do these the global level, relate to the everyday life level, right? And for Lefebvre, the production of space is one of the essential mediations, between these two levels, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this is the perspective that I find is quite original, even within the Marxist tradition. I mean, others have, of course, people like Raymond Williams, in his great work, The Country and the City, has a very, complementary and almost similar understanding, but of space and spatial relations and social relations. But and Walter Benjamin is another, highly original, thinker who kind of tuned into some of these, spatial and everyday life, questions. But Lefebvre, I think, kind of presents it in the most persuasive way, through a series of works, because he wrote on everyday life, from the mid 1940s, from the immediately after the Second World War until until pretty much the end of his life, around 1990, 91, and so for more than almost 40, 50 years, everyday life was a kind of a enduring, theme, for him. And then from the 60s onwards, he started, working on space, starting with actually rural space, right, the countryside, and then urban space as well, but also especially in a political way, as expressed in the 1968 book, The Right to the City, right, and followed a couple of years later by the Urban Revolution, and in 1974, the production of space, his greatest, richest work on space. But immediately after the production of space, he wrote 4 massive, volumes on the state, right? So, including, on, with special attention to problems of uneven development, imperialism, and questions like this, which are, again, not typically part of state theory, even within, some Marxist strands of theory, right? And so here you see the 3 levels, right? The everyday life work and the state and capital, the more political economic stuff, but, mediating between them, the writings on space, right? And so it is a mediation, right? It is through the production of space that these global forces come into our everyday life, right? But it is a contested level also, because people don't want to be alienated, dominated, as he said in exactly that passage that you quoted. It's like, so space becomes a form and expression of alienation,
Yes,
of all kinds, right? And in that sense, it is a vital mediation, right? So, but who likes alienation? Everyone.
who likes alienation?
Right? So we all want to struggle against alienation, but this mediation therefore becomes a site of struggle.
Yes,
right? So space becomes a site of struggle in this perspective on totality,
yes.
That Lefebvre offers us. And I think this is extremely valuable, and for me particularly, as somebody who was trained as an architect and as an urban planner, and who now teaches, in a planning program within the geography and planning department, I think for my intellectual and also practical, and political orientation, Lefebvre has been extremely important.
Mm-hmm. I really love your engagement on this point of mediation with Gillian Rose, where you say the opposite of mediate is immediate, right? It's a wonderful way of understanding the role of ideology and why thinking about the urban is so central. I quite like this very much. Well, this is a related question because one of the things I appreciate so much about your work is the way it's grounded. So as a kind of, in a typical materialist fashion, you ground your analysis in the movement of capital, the relations of production, the frictions that impair its flows. But as you say, like Lefebvre, like Walter Benjamin, like a number of other thinkers, you are simultaneously attendant to, as you say, the level of everyday life, but also the realm of the sensorial, the importance of, I think in a more Benjaminian sense, of dream worlds, of desire. In your Antipode article on the urban sensorium, you quote Marx in saying, "The world has long possessed in the form of a dream something of which it only has to be conscious of in order to possess it in reality." So I would just like to invite you to say a little bit more. Why is this an important register for you to work at?
Yeah, the quotation from Marx is one of his letters to Ruger, right? Arnold Ruger, like from the 1840s, I think. So so that a couple of things to talk about here. I think that your question makes me think about. One is the utopian, dimension, of everyday life, right? And the other aspect is, of course, the problem of ideology, right? Forms of popular consciousness, and how they're produced, and so in my doctoral work, when I wrote my dissertation, I was extremely influenced by Walter Benjamin's work, exactly on these kinds of questions, partly because I was studying at Cornell University, and Susan Buck-Moss, the great writer on Benjamin and the Frankfurt School, among other things, was one of my PhD committee members, and I had great political economists, Bill Goldsmith and Jeff Waite from German Studies, who kind of introduced me to Gramsci, Althusser, and these kinds of the Marxist theories of ideology and forms of consciousness. So so in my dissertation, my kind of central question became, how does space mediate ideology, right? So my empirical kind of ground for the research was, bit of like a Los Angeles, most of all, of course, influenced by Mike Davis's incomparable work, and but also thinking about the radical transformations brought about by neoliberalism in Sri Lanka. So I was a teenager, in the 1970s, when the open economy, kind of was introduced, and suddenly you had all kinds of commodities, like cars, chewing gum, hair dryers, televisions, so I grew up without TV, right, until I was like 14, 15 years old. So television came to Sri Lanka in 1979, so a couple of years after, and straight away color, we didn't have black and white television, so the
missed that phase.
But it was so I experienced as a kid, right, this great transformation, really, from like a kind of a third world, country trying to sort of follow some kind of part of the non-aligned kind of a politics suddenly being inserted into this global, consumer capitalism, right? And this was a palpable experience, on the streets, so the idea of the urban sensorium really came out of that, I think, so because I understood instinctively even then, in the 70s in Sri Lanka, that this kind of transformation of everyday experience has very profound political implications, right? So people's aspirations, desires, they are fundamentally modified, like influence, in this sort of new commodity consumer kind of a, world. I didn't know words like postmodernism then, but of course,
it comes with the color TV.
Yeah. But, when I was a grad student, doing my PhD, you couldn't avoid this word, of course, so Frederick Jameson was also on my reading list. And significant influence, for my research as well. And but I wanted to kind of keep alive this utopian perspective, of Marx, of Benjamin, of and Ernst Bloch, and of people like that. And so that's kind of what led me to kind of think about the relationship, how space mediates ideology, in my dissertation work. But I tend to go off in tangents, but to come back to your question, the real challenge is to understand the experience of space in a dialectical perspective. That is to say, on the one hand, it is, as Lefebvre, says, including in the quotation that you brought up, it is, of course, an expression and a manifestation of alienation. But it is also the space of desire, like the site in which and like struggle against alienation can take concrete shape, and form, right? So there's something utopian, about the experience of space, right? And it is there in everyday life, right? So the problem really, if you want to pose it as a political problem, it is really about the organization of this utopian desire, against the experience of alienation, right? Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for that, Kanishka. There's no tangent at all. That was really beautiful, and it brings to mind the work of a young Palestinian geographer that we are hoping to interview this season, named Hisham Abu Shama, who also thinks about the possibilities of space. He writes about a map without guarantees. And the current conjuncture is indisputably being defined at this moment by the genocide in Palestine. And I think it poses some new challenges for how we imagine global solidarity, internationalism, and the world we want to build. I want to ask you a little bit about how we might theorize internationalism today. And I suppose I want to come back to some of the thoughts that you had earlier about Fanon, because I've heard you reflect on internationalism and the relationship between the particular and the universal, which I think is really rich for how you theorize it. So I just wonder if you could talk a little bit about theorizing internationalism and the challenges for doing it today.
Yeah, the challenges are formidable. We have to acknowledge that. I think first of all, but I think at least one theoretical precondition, for, let's say, meeting, rising to the level of the profound challenges is the development of the capacity to think that the particular and the universal are not opposed. They are related in a dialectical sense, and in fact, there's no universal that can be achieved without a particular, right? But without a universal, no particular can be emancipating. So that may be a bit of a strong formulation, but this my approach, at a theoretical level, but to put it in a very kind of a straightforward kind of a way, right? But let's at a more kind of a obvious political level, we should think about how the meanings and forms of internationalism have evolved over time, right? And so when Marx and Engels wrote the Communist Manifesto in 1848, the famous last sentence, proletarians of all countries unite, right? So this was a great expression, of internationalism, this, the spirit and the principle, and Marx also said, proletarians have really no country, so but if we think about, but that kind of spirit of internationalism, which I think informed, of course, also the in the post-colonial conjuncture, the tricontinental movement, for example. But somewhere after the Second World War, and between the end of the Second World War and the rise of neoliberalism, something changed, and I think what happened was this idea of internationalism was somehow taken over by capital, the right, so by the discourse of globalization, right? Which was, and kind of a sentiment and an argument against nation states, right? And their ability, of course, to control the flows of commodities, right? And free trade, so the free trade kind of internationalism. So the discourse of internationalism was hijacked, from neoliberalism, and the left, I think, in many places around the world, kind of became more and more particular, about their own struggles, got a little bit more stuck in their particularisms, right? And so this, and perhaps some aspects of identity politics is another postmodern kind of a symptom of the same kind of broader shift that I'm talking about, right? But I think this again one reason that I consider Fanon very important, is the left, or the emancipatory politics cannot let go of an idea of universalism, of humanism, and in some ways, this is the idea of universalism is really the theoretical expression of what we mean by solidarity, right? At a more obvious, direct political level, right? But what is the basis of solidarity, right? With whom must an emancipatory struggle in a particular place, seek solidarity with, right? So there has to be some kind of a principle, that is the basis of solidarity, right? And I think clarification of that principle, that can be the basis for different, emancipatory struggles to come together. This has to be reworked, reinvented, and that is the task of thinking about internationalism today, right? So we have to take into consideration the changing the changed form and nature of the nation state. So it's not like globalization has done away with the nation state, quite the opposite. And even neoliberalism has not done this at all. I mean, this very well from your work on and background in abolition, so it's not kind of a neoliberalism was not against the state. It simply kind of reconfigured the state, right, in a particular way. So we need to kind of understand what has really happened to the nation state, right? Its capacity to do progressive things, right, and to produce ensure a political space within which emancipatory struggles can have more leeway, like a greater freedom, let's say, and but also to have a global and universal perspective, so without that, and I think you started this question with a essential reference to what's happening in Gaza, Palestine today. So, and I think there's been a lot of solidarity, from many from around the world with Palestine and the situation, confronted, unimaginable in many ways, that horrors like this are happening, in this day and age, so but this is a kind of a great moment, I think, to think about the principle, the basis on which solidarities across places and cultures, can be forged, in an emancipatory and hopefully in a revolutionary, transformatory direction.
Yes, hopefully, yes. Well, thank you for that. I think I'd like to end where we began. So we started talking about how you began as a architect and planner in Sri Lanka, and then you became a scholar. So I want to ask you about why do this work. So the kind of common sense refrain is that academic work is elitist, out of touch, and irrelevant. And this is consistently the point made by our enemies on the right wing, but it often is a refrain repeated on the left and strangely in universities, a kind of anti-intellectualism or a hostility to this kind of work. And yet here we are, and here you are doing this. So I'm just kind of curious, you made a choice a long time ago to pursue this work. Why do it, and what's its significance now?
Yeah, it's a good question. And to be perfectly honest, like I'm, still working out a good answer to this question. But some in my own case, it was kind of not. It happened before I realized it had happened. Going into ending up in an academic job. So it was But I think in my experience, the primary motivation was really some kind of politically informed intellectual curiosity, right? So I felt, given where I was, in my kind of 20s, the I there was a lot to be learned and gained, from being in universities for me, and I was also fortunate to get some, scholarships, to do graduate studies in the US. And after investing, like nearly 10, 7, 8, 10 years in that kind of work, an academic career seemed not a terribly unusual kind of a choice. But I think I've always been extremely conscious of the fact that, I even started reading Marx and kind of engaging, people like Fanon and others, because of the political experiences that I had, as a young, undergraduate student, trying to make sense of what was going on in Sri Lanka. And I understand the university, therefore, as one of the sites, of political struggle, right? So I mean, I think although the right-wing media thinks, universities are taken over by cultural Marxists or whatever, like, I think, I don't like, people doing left critical work, we are by no means the majority or the hegemonic, or dominant force, within the universities, but we have kind of carved out some space, but and that is not an insignificant achievement, especially in political contexts where people need space and some time and resources to think, right? And so theory is important, particularly important for the most practical and realistic politics, right? And so theoretical, intellectual work, serious research, I think the universities can play a very important role. So there's some skepticism I have about the what is happening to the neoliberalization and corporatization of the universities as institutions. So there's a built-in systemic tendency for people to become like careerist, right, and think about their work in terms of success in metrics, right, and as increasingly measured by university administrators. But if we can kind of somehow resist some of those tendencies and temptations and keep in touch with kind of basic fundamental political commitments, the university can play, among other institutions, a crucial role in progressive or even radical politics. So the kind of Marxist tradition, at least one part of the Marxist tradition that I'm trained in, called Western Marxism, unfortunate name, I think, but Perry Anderson, who coined this phrase, it's not a geographical reference, but it's really a kind of a political category. His definition of Western Marxism is a kind of Marxism that kind of lost on the battlefields. After the failures of the German revolutions, Italian and other European revolutions, after the Bolshevik revolution of 1917. So the thinking and some of the intellectual energy of these failed left revolutionary movements sort of gravitated towards the university as a kind of sanctuary almost, right? And survived there in some way. But in his book, he was also kind of critical, of some of the developments within, Western Marxism that can be attributed to it sort of being kind of stuck, in this university space, cut off from, popular and more real kind of struggles, right? So it is extremely important to kind of build this relationship, between what the most serious intellectual work and research, that can happen in university with the radical political movements that are happening in the real world.
Absolutely. Well, thanks so much, Kanishka. That was really rich. I appreciate reminding us of the university as a temporary site of struggle, a shelter, and thinking about political projects that come from defeat. There's a lot I could ask you about all those things, but I want to respect your time and just ask, is there anything I haven't asked you that you would like to add?
Yeah, sure. So maybe it's a kind of like a better way to approach the question of internationalism. So since you are in Toronto, and you have just spoken to Stefan Kipfer and you intend to speak to Himani Banerjee, we can think about Toronto, as a space where, all these different people, me from, Sri Lanka, Stefan with his, political experiences and urban activism from Zurich, coming here and meeting him was, extremely important for me to actually, engage, Henri Lefebvre in a serious way. And Himani happens to be my neighbor, so I learned a great deal, from her, just, sitting in a living room like this, usually, between midnight and 3 in the morning, all kinds of stories about her political upbringing, experiences, and the milieus that she grew up in India before coming here and doing really pioneering work on anti-racism, socialist feminism, and so on. So I think the urban space of Toronto is a kind of one of those centralities, meeting places, in the sense that Lefebvre, theorized space as a form of centrality that has brought together people like Himani, Stefan, and others, and the great colleagues and friends at York University who have produced such a great left intellectual culture there. And there is one such note, in the global totality, and, there are other places, in London, Paris, serve, in a similar role. And as you know, from your own work on the Mexican Revolution, some of these, the key thinkers and actors met in places like, London, Paris, and New York even, and and we can think about Dar es Salaam, in the early 70s, Algiers, Beirut, and so there is a, so we can think about internationalism in a very concrete, spatial kind of way, So as since we are speaking and meeting and speaking in Toronto, and since we started our discussion with some reflections on space and how space can be political, we can say it is this potential to bring together, create these nodal points within a global network of radical utopian energy. That I think is what is great about Toronto, and also gives some hope about the prospects of internationalism.
Absolutely. Well, it's been phenomenal to spend time in this radical convergence space of Toronto, and I appreciate your explanation. In the U.S., we might just say there must be something in the water, but I appreciate all the work that you all do and the intellectual environment that you've created together. It's been so generative for so many of us. So thank you for your work, and thank you for spending time with us on Conjuncture today.
Thank you.
This has been really wonderful. And to all our listeners and viewers, please stay tuned.